Europe, the year 1320. A butcher has just slaughtered a pig. The smell of fresh blood fills the air. Villagers gather around, and the meat looks glorious, enough to feed families for weeks. But there's a problem. It's midsummer. The air is warm, flies are buzzing, and without preservation, that meat will rot in less than a day. There are no refrigerators, no freezers, no vacuum-sealed packaging. And yet, medieval people survived. They didn't just survive. They thrived, hosting feasts, traveling on crusades, and enduring brutal winters with enough food to last months. How did they do it? How did ordinary peasants, kings, soldiers, and even monks preserve food without modern technology? Today, we're going back in time to uncover the fascinating and sometimes disgusting secrets of medieval food preservation. From smoke-filled huts to underground cellars, from barrels of salt to honey-drenched meat, this is the story of survival before refrigeration. And let me ask you this. If you lived in the Middle Ages, which method would you trust more? Smoking, salting, or fermenting? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to see which one you think could keep you alive. Chapter 1. Why preserving food was life or death. For us today, food is everywhere. Supermarkets, refrigerators, fast delivery. But for a medieval family, food was never guaranteed. Every harvest was a gamble. A late frost, a swarm of locusts, or a poorly timed storm could mean hunger. Or famine. Preserving food wasn't just about convenience. It was about survival. Winters were long and brutal. Fresh vegetables disappeared after autumn. Meat from livestock could only be eaten immediately unless preserved. And during wartime sieges, when enemies surrounded castles for months, stored food determined who lived and who starved. For peasants, even a small store of preserved grain or smoked meat meant the difference between enduring winter or watching their children waste away. For nobles, preserved food stocked their kitchens, fueled feasts, and maintained power. Armies marched on preserved food, sailors crossed seas with it, and monasteries depended on it to feed dozens of monks throughout the year. Without preservation, medieval life would have been impossible. Chapter 2. Salt, the white gold of the Middle Ages. The first great weapon against spoilage? Salt. Salt wasn't just seasoning in the Middle Ages. It was life. It preserved fish, meat, and even some vegetables. By drawing out moisture, salt created an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. Imagine barrels filled with salted herring, stacked high in a medieval market. These barrels could be transported across Europe, feeding armies, monasteries, and cities far from the sea. Salt was so valuable that entire wars were fought over it. It fueled economies, shaped trade routes, and gave birth to cities. In fact, the word salary comes from salt, because Roman soldiers were once paid partly in salt, and the tradition of salt as wealth carried on into the medieval world. 4. Coastal communities, especially in Northern Europe, salted fish was a staple. The Catholic Church's strict rules on fasting days, when meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed, made salted herring and cod some of the most consumed foods of the era. In fact, some historians argue that without salt preservation, the Church's dietary laws would have been impossible to follow. But salt wasn't cheap. For peasants, it was precious and sometimes scarce. Nobles and merchants, however, controlled access to salt mines and salt trade, making it a symbol of wealth and power. Salt was, quite literally, the refrigerator of the medieval world. 3. Smoke and fire, the smoky secret of survival. Step into a medieval village and you might see a small hut, smoke pouring from its roof. Inside, strips of pork, beef, or fish hang above a smoldering fire. This was the smokehouse, a vital tool of preservation. Smoking meat and fish did two things. It dried the food, reducing moisture, and it coated it with compounds from the smoke that slowed bacterial growth. The result was a dark, smoky piece of meat that could last for weeks, even months, without spoiling. Different woods gave different flavors. Oak, beech, and applewood were favorites. Smoking wasn't just practical, it made food taste delicious. In fact, smoked ham, sausages, and fish were delicacies that crossed social classes, enjoyed by peasants and nobles alike. Now imagine the smell, rich, earthy, with hints of wood. In a world where rot and decay were constant threats, smoked food was a treasure. Soldiers on campaigns carried smoked meat. Sailors brought smoked fish on voyages. Even monasteries built smokehouses to feed their monks through the winter. Of course, smoking had limits. In damp weather, food could still spoil. But combined with salting, it was a powerful duo that kept meat edible far beyond its natural life. Chapter 4. Pickling, Fermentation, and Vinegar, the Science of Rot. If salt and smoke were medieval refrigerators, pickling and fermentation were medieval chemistry. Vinegar was a common preservative. Vegetables, fruits, and even meats were soaked in it. The acidity of vinegar created an environment where bacteria struggled to grow. Pickled cabbage, onions, and cucumbers weren't just tangy snacks, they were survival food. Fermentation was equally important. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut. Milk became cheese. Grains turned into beer. All of these not only preserved food, but sometimes made it safer. In fact, beer and ale were often safer to drink than water, which was frequently contaminated. Fermentation had another benefit. It added nutrition. Sauerkraut, for instance, provided vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy long before anyone knew what vitamins were. To a medieval peasant, a barrel of fermented cabbage or pickled onions could be the difference between health and starvation. 5. Honey, nature's preserver. Now here's a sweet surprise. Honey is naturally antibacterial. Ancient and medieval people noticed that food stored in honey seemed to last far longer. Meat could be submerged in honey, fruits could be candied in it, and even medicines were mixed with honey to keep them potent. For nobles and the wealthy, honey-preserved fruits were luxurious treats. Imagine biting into a honey-coated fig in a medieval castle. It wasn't just food, it was a status symbol. Monks also treasured honey, not only for food preservation, but for making mead, a fermented honey drink that was both a delicacy and a way to store calories in liquid form. Chapter 6. Grain and root storage, the forgotten heroes. Not all food preservation required fancy methods. Sometimes it was about clever storage. Grain was the backbone of medieval diets. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Stored properly in granaries, these could last for months, even years. Rats and mold were constant enemies, so granaries were built. High off the ground, sealed tightly, and guarded root vegetables like carrots. Turnips and parsnips were buried in sand, stored in pits, or placed in cool cellars. This kept them fresh throughout winter. Apples and pears were sometimes stored the same way, carefully wrapped and stacked. For peasants, this was survival food, humble, reliable, and essential. Chapter 7. Cellars, ice houses, and natural cooling. Even without electricity, medieval people found ways to use the earth itself as a refrigerator. Underground cellars were common, especially in castles and monasteries. These spaces stayed cool year-round, perfect for storing barrels of ale, salted meat, and root vegetables. Wealthy nobles sometimes built ice houses, where winter ice was packed in straw and buried underground, lasting well into summer. This was rare and luxurious, but it shows how creative people could be. In mountain regions, snow and ice were sometimes collected and stored for cooling drinks or food, a medieval version of chilled wine. Chapter 8. Exotic spices, preserving or just hiding rot. Here's where myth meets reality. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg poured into Europe through trade routes. Some claim they were used to preserve meat. In truth, spices didn't preserve food very well, but they did something else. They covered up the taste of spoilage, for the wealthy, heavily spiced dishes were not only fashionable but practical. Nobles could afford imported pepper and cinnamon, turning questionable meat into something edible. For peasants, though, spices were out of reach. They relied on salt, smoke, and cellars, not peppercorns from India. Still, the spice trade shaped medieval cuisine, wealth, and exploration. Chapter 9. Daily Life and Food Stories. To truly understand medieval preservation, we need to imagine daily life. A peasant family might slaughter a pig in late autumn. Every part would be preserved, meat salted or smoked, intestines turned into sausage, fat rendered into lard, and even the blood turned into pudding. Nothing went to waste. A noble's castle might have entire rooms filled with salted venison, smoked fish, pickled vegetables, and honeyed fruits. Feasts were fueled by preservation. Monks, bound by strict schedules, relied on barrels of salted fish and preserved vegetables to sustain their communities. And armies? Entire campaigns depended on barrels of salted meat, dried biscuits, and smoked fish. Without these, soldiers couldn't march, conquer, or defend. Chapter 10. Conclusion. Survival without refrigeration. Food preservation in the Middle Ages wasn't just about eating. It was about survival, power, and even culture. Salt-fueled trade, smoke-flavored diets, fermentation kept people healthy, and honey added sweetness to life. From humble peasants to mighty kings, everyone relied on these methods to endure the challenges of their world. So, next time you open your fridge, think about how ingenious and desperate medieval people had to be. And here's my final question for you. If you had to live in the Middle Ages for 1 year, which preserved food do you think you'd rely on most? Salted fish, smoked meat, pickled cabbage, or honeyed fruit? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your medieval survival plan.